The chipped mug warmed my hands, but the chill wasn't just in the autumn air filtering through the slightly warped window frame of the kitchen. It was bone deep, a permanent frost that had settled in the mirror the day Richard packed his meticulously organized suitcases. He stood there in the hallway he designed, beneath the skylight he'd insisted on, talking about needing space and rediscovering himself. Clichés sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't look at me, not really. His eyes scanned the expensive Turkish rug, the antique console table I'd found, the life we'd curated piece by painful piece over 32 years, as if cataloging assets for division. His voice was smooth, practiced, the same tone he used closing deals, reassuring nervous clients. Only this time I was the liability being gracefully shed. He spoke of amicable separation, of mutual respect, of still caring deeply. Lies spun from the same silk he used for his custom-made ties. I remember focusing on a loose thread on his cashmere sweater, a tiny imperfection in his otherwise flawless presentation. It felt like the only real thing in the room. He didn't mention Tiffany, of course, not then. He wouldn't soil his carefully constructed narrative of thoughtful uncoupling with something as grubby as the truth. That came later, trickling out through awkward silences from mutual friends, pitying glances from neighbors, and finally a casually cruel confirmation dropped by our eldest son, Mark, who seemed to think pragmatism was the highest form of filial duty. Dad's happy, Mom, isn't that what matters? Happy. Such a small, inadequate word for the wreckage he'd left behind. Happiness built on the foundations of my shattered trust, my misplaced devotion. This house, our house, suddenly felt cavernous, echoing with the ghosts of laughter, arguments, whispered promises now rendered meaningless. Every photograph on the mantelpiece felt like a mockery, smiling strangers frozen in a time I no longer recognized. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating, thick with unspoken accusations and the weight of decades discarded like last season's fashion. He wanted space. He got it. He just hadn't anticipated how much space I would eventually claim for myself, in ways he couldn't possibly comprehend, focused as he always was on the tangible, the transactional, the things he could control. He never understood the quiet currents running beneath the surface, the resilience forged in the crucible of his casual disregard. He saw a wife, a homemaker, a support system. He never saw the woman holding the pen, the one who would eventually rewrite the ending he thought was already set in stone. The chill remained, yes, but somewhere beneath it, a tiny ember of defiance began to glow, fueled by the cold, hard reality of his betrayal. He thought he was closing a chapter. He had no idea I was preparing to write an entirely new book. We met young, ridiculously young. I was studying literature, dreaming of poetry and quiet corners in dusty libraries. He was ambition personified, already mapping out his climb up the corporate ladder, sharp suits and sharper focus. He swept me off my feet with whirlwind pronouncements and grand gestures that, in retrospect, felt more like strategic maneuvers than genuine passion. He needed a partner, yes, but one who fit the image, who would reflect his success, manage the domestic sphere flawlessly, and host charming dinner parties where he could shine. I mistook his need for love, my willingness to support his dreams for shared purpose. I put my own aspirations aside, the half-finished novel, the desire for a small bookshop perhaps, telling myself it was a temporary sacrifice for our future. Our future became his future, decorated with my efforts. I learned to anticipate his moods, smooth over his social awkwardness, manage the household finances with a magician's skill on the often tighter than expected budget he allocated while funding his own expensive hobbies. Golf clubs, vintage cars, tailored suits, investments in his image, he called them. My contributions, raising Mark and our daughter Claire, managing renovations, volunteering strategically at charities that boosted his profile, were simply expected. Duties performed. He rarely praised, merely accepted. Compliments were reserved for his colleagues, his clients, the mirror. Over the years, a subtle narrative took hold, one he carefully cultivated. He was the provider, the achiever, the one whose time and energy were valuable. Mine were available, expendable. I remember one evening years ago, Claire had a terrible fever. I'd been up with her all night, exhausted, worried. Richard had an early, important meeting. As he knotted his tie, he glanced towards the bedroom where Claire was finally sleeping fitfully. "Try to keep her quiet this morning, Alina," he'd said, not unkindly, but with the unmistakable air of someone whose vital work must not be disturbed by the messy realities of family life. Not, "How is she?" Not, "Do you need help?" Just, "Don't let your problems inconvenience me." It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps, but it lodged itself deep within me, a tiny splinter of resentment I couldn't quite dislodge. Those splinters accumulated over time, forming a thick protective callus around my heart. The children saw it in their own ways. Mark, ever his father's son, admired Richard's success, adopting his dismissive tone towards me at times, mimicking his impatience. Claire, quieter, more observant, would often seek me out, her hugs lingering, her eyes reflecting a sympathy she couldn't articulate. She saw the cost, I think. She saw the slow erosion of my spirit, the way I learned to shrink myself to fit the space he allowed. We maintained the facade, though. Anniversary parties with champagne and forced smiles, family holidays where the tension simmered just beneath the surface of posed photographs. We were the picture of suburban success, a testament to Richard's achievements. And I was the silent partner, the invisible scaffolding holding the entire structure aloft. He never realized that scaffolding had its own foundations, its own strength, independent of him. He certainly never imagined it could be withdrawn, leaving his carefully constructed world perilously unsupported. The discovery wasn't dramatic, no lipstick on the collar or clandestine meetings witnessed. It was mundane, digital, utterly impersonal. A shared tablet usually relegated to recipes and online shopping, left open on his email account. An accident, sheer carelessness on his part. He becomes so comfortable in his deceit, so confident in my assumed obliviousness. The subject line was innocuous, meeting confirmation, but the sender wasn't a client. It was Tiffany Dubois, his executive assistant. Young, blonde, efficient Tiffany, whose name had started cropping up in his conversation with increasing frequency over the past year. Praised for her organizational skills, her initiative, her dedication. I'd met her a few times at company events. Polite, professionally charming, a little too eager to please, perhaps. I hadn't thought much of it, why would I? After 32 years, you don't expect the oldest cliché in the book to walk into your life wearing sensible heels and carrying a branded tote bag. The email thread itself was short, confirming dinner reservations at a ridiculously expensive new restaurant downtown, a place he dismissed as pretentious when I'd suggested it for our anniversary. But it wasn't the logistics that made my blood run cold. It was the sign-off. Can't wait. Love T, followed by a string of emojis I didn't understand but whose implication was painfully clear. Love. A word he hadn't used with me, not genuinely, not with that easy intimacy, in years. It was like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I sank onto the kitchen stool, the sleek modern stool he'd chosen, feeling the cold metal press against my skin. Suddenly, fragments clicked into place. The late nights at the office. The unexplained weekend conferences. The sudden interest in new colognes and expensive gym memberships. His increasing impatience with me, the subtle criticisms about my appearance, my opinions, my very presence. It wasn't stress. It wasn't a midlife crisis. It was her, Tiffany, the replacement, waiting patiently in the wings, or perhaps not so patiently. I confronted him that evening, the tablet clutched in my trembling hand like damning evidence. I expected denial, anger, perhaps even shame. I got none of it. He sighed, that weary sigh he used when I interrupted his work. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Eleanor, he began, his voice infuriatingly calm, I was going to tell you, I've been meaning to find the right time. The right time, as if there's a right time to detonate someone's life. He didn't apologize, he rationalized. He spoke of feeling unseen, unappreciated, the very feelings I'd been swallowing down for decades because of him. He painted himself as the victim of a stale marriage, conveniently omitting his role in its stagnation. He admitted the affair had been going on for nearly 2 years. 2 years of shared jokes I wasn't in on, stolen moments, a parallel life lived while I obliviously maintained the home front. And Tiffany, she understands me, he said, the ultimate insult. She makes me feel alive. He didn't explicitly blame me, but the implication hung heavy in the air. I wasn't enough. I was the comfortable old shoe, she was the exciting new pair. He packed his bags that night efficiently, decisively. No tears, no backward glances, just a cool, we'll talk lawyers next week. Let's try to keep this civilized for the children's sake. Civilized. He'd torched our shared history, betrayed every vow, and he wanted civilized. He wanted me to manage the emotional fallout just as I'd managed everything else, quietly and without making a scene. The door closed behind him, the click echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence. I was alone, replaced, the debris of 32 years scattered around my feet. The pain was incandescent, searing through the numbness. He hadn't just left me, he'd tried to erase me. The lawyers' offices were temples of hushed tones and expensive leather, places where lives were dissected and assigned monetary value. Richard's lawyer was exactly the type you'd expect. Slick, predatory, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mine, a woman named Sarah Chen, recommended by a friend, was calm, methodical, her quiet competence a welcome anchor in the storm. The initial meetings were brutal. Richard, flanked by his legal shark, presented his version of our life. A partnership where his financial contributions vastly outweighed my domestic ones. He spoke of his assets, his investments, minimizing my role, my sacrifices, my 32 years of unpaid labor that had enabled his precious career. He proposed a settlement that was insulting, barely enough to maintain the lifestyle he expected me to quietly disappear from. His charm was deployed strategically, attempting to portray himself as reasonable, generous even, while simultaneously trying to strip me bare. Alina deserves to be comfortable, of course, he'd say magnanimously, before his lawyer presented figures that suggested comfortable meant a small apartment and a drastically reduced standard of living. He wanted the house sold immediately, naturally. Cash out his equity so he could invest in his shiny new life with Tiffany. The house where we'd raised our children, the garden I'd poured my soul into, the place that held the tapestry of our shared history, reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. He even tried to use the children subtly at first. Mark, already echoing his father's perspective, called me, urging me to be reasonable and not drag things out. He talked about Dad being stressed, about the new relationship being serious. Tiffany's actually really nice, Mom, he'd offered, twisting the knife with oblivious sincerity. Claire was quieter, torn. She visited, bringing groceries I hadn't asked for, her eyes filled with a helpless sorrow. She hated seeing us fight, hated the division. Richard knew how to exploit that, playing the wounded father looking for reconciliation while simultaneously instructing his lawyer to play hardball. There were moments I almost buckled. The sheer exhaustion of the fight, the constant emotional attrition, the feeling of being pitted against my own son. Richard's narrative that I was being difficult, emotional, vindictive started to seep into my own thoughts. Was it wrong to want what felt fair, what felt just? Sarah was invaluable then. She patiently dismantled their arguments, highlighted my non-financial contributions, unearthed financial records Richard had conveniently forgot about. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that decades of partnership, of mutual support, even if one-sided in effort, had legal standing. Don't let him gaslight you, Alina, she'd said during one particularly draining session after Richard had implied my memory of certain financial agreements was flawed. He's used to controlling the narrative. We won't let him. It was seeing him in that sterile office environment, stripped of the familiar domestic backdrop, that finally allowed me to see him clearly. Not the husband I'd loved or thought I loved, but a cold, calculating man focused solely on self-preservation and image management. The betrayal wasn't just Tiffany. It was the realization that the man I'd dedicated my life to likely never saw me as an equal partner, merely a useful accessory. The fight wasn't just about money or the house. It was about reclaiming my own value, refusing to be erased financially as well as emotionally. The process was slow, agonizing, chipping away at my reserves. But with each concession forced from him, each manipulative tactic Sarah countered, that ember of defiance within me grew a little stronger, fanned by the cold wind of his indifference. He wanted civilized, he would get legally precise. The days bled into weeks, then months. The house, once filled with the noise of family life, now seemed to hold its breath, amplifying my solitude. Mornings were the hardest, waking up to the empty space beside me in the bed, the silence where his pre-work routine used to be. I'd wander through the rooms, touching furniture, looking at photographs, trying to reconcile the life I remembered with the harsh reality of the present. Friends called, some offering genuine support, others awkward condolences laced with poorly concealed curiosity. Invitations dwindled. I was no longer part of a couple, a neat social unit. I was a loose end, a reminder of uncomfortable truths. The pitying glances were almost worse than the silence. Then came the inevitable sighting. A local farmer's market, one Saturday morning. I was choosing tomatoes, enjoying the simple, grounding task when I heard his laugh. That familiar, booming laugh he saved for public occasions. I looked up, my heart seizing. There he was, standing by a cheese stall, arms slung casually around Tiffany's shoulders. She looked radiant, laughing up at him, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers. They looked like a magazine advertisement for second chance happiness. Seeing them together, so carelessly public, so oblivious to the wake of their actions, felt like swallowing shards of glass. He saw me then. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a mask of polite surprise. He gave a small, awkward wave, as if bumping into a distant acquaintance. Tiffany turned, her expression momentarily curious, then settling into a bland, practiced smile. I couldn't breathe. I just turned, abandoning my tomatoes, and walked away, my face burning, tears blurring the cheerful market scene. That encounter fueled a dark period. The loneliness felt less like solitude and more like abandonment. I replayed decades of memories, searching for clues I'd missed, blaming myself for not seeing the cracks sooner. Had I been too complacent, too trusting? Had I poured so much of myself into him and the family that there was nothing left of the woman I used to be? Sleep offered little respite, haunted by dreams of falling, of being lost in familiar places that suddenly became strange and menacing. Mark's calls became less frequent, filled with an uncomfortable formality. He was spending more time with his father and Tiffany, embracing the new dynamic. Claire visited often, her presence a quiet comfort, but I could see the strain on her, caught between her parents. One rainy afternoon, staring out at the garden I'd neglected since he left, the roses unpruned, the weeds creeping in, I felt an overwhelming wave of despair wash over me. This garden, like my life, felt overgrown, choked, abandoned. I sank onto the muddy grass, heedless of the damp, and wept. Raw, ragged sobs for the lost years, the broken trust, the woman I feared I'd become. But as the rain plastered my hair to my face and the earth felt cold beneath my hands, something shifted. A flicker of anger, cold and clear, cut through the grief. Anger at him, yes, but also anger at myself for letting his departure define my entire existence. I wouldn't let him have that power. I wouldn't let him, or Tiffany, reduce me to a weeping woman in a neglected garden. Slowly, I got to my feet, mud staining my clothes. I went inside, washed my face, and made a cup of tea. Then I found my gardening gloves, the sturdy ones he'd always scoffed at as unnecessary. I went back outside into the drizzle and began systematically pulling out the weeds, one by one. It was hard work, my muscles protesting, my hands aching. But with each weed pulled, each thorny rose branch pruned back, I felt a sliver of control return. I wasn't just tending the garden, I was reclaiming my ground. The turning point didn't arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic revelation. It came during a mundane meeting with Sarah Chen, my lawyer, to review the final settlement figures. We fought hard, and while it wasn't everything I felt I deserved, it was significantly better than Richard's initial insulting offer. I would keep the house at least for now, though the mortgage was daunting on my own. As we went through the paperwork, Sarah paused, tapping a clause related to future inheritances. "This is standard," she explained, ensuring neither party has a claim on future windfalls received by the other after the divorce is finalized. A thought sparked, sudden and sharp. My parents. They weren't wealthy by Richard's standards, but they had been careful, frugal people. Their home, modest but mortgage-free, and their savings constituted a respectable inheritance, earmarked solely for me, their only child. Richard had always known about it, of course. He'd even, on occasion, factored it into his long-term financial projections, speaking vaguely of when your parents' place frees up capital, as if it were a joint asset waiting to be liquidated. He'd offered unsolicited advice on managing the portfolio, suggested renovations to increase the house's value, always with the underlying assumption that he would be involved, that it would ultimately benefit us, meaning him. His sense of entitlement had extended even to my family's legacy. Lying in bed that night, the house silent around me, the idea took root. My parents will clearly named me as the sole beneficiary. But what about my will? The one I'd drafted years ago, naming Richard as the primary beneficiary naturally and the children as secondary. It felt like another chain binding me to him, another area where his assumptions held sway. He'd replaced me in his life so carelessly, so cruelly. Why should he remain in mine, even hypothetically, after my death? Why should he benefit from the legacy of the parents who had loved me, supported me, and quietly disapproved of his self-centeredness for years? A few weeks later, Richard called. It wasn't unusual, logistical details about the divorce still needed sorting. But his tone was different. Warmer, almost conciliatory. He talked about a new business venture, an exciting opportunity, but requiring significant upfront investment. Then casually, "You know, Alina, once things settle with your parents' estate eventually, that could really give this project the boost it needs. A sound investment for the future, for the kids' legacy too." The audacity of it stole my breath. The divorce wasn't even final. He was living with the woman he left me for, and he was already earmarking my future inheritance for his business venture. He still saw my resources, my legacy, as extensions of his own plans. He hadn't learned a thing. That conversation solidified my resolve. It wasn't about revenge, not exactly. It was about severing the final tie, reclaiming my autonomy, protecting what was mine and what my parents had worked their lives for. It was about ensuring that the future they intended for me wasn't co-opted by the man who had thrown mine away. The next day, I called Sarah Chen's office again. Not about the divorce, but to schedule an appointment with her colleague who specialized in estate planning. It was time to update my will. He thought he knew the ending. He was wrong. The appointment with the estate lawyer, Mr. Davies, felt different from the tense divorce negotiations. Quieter, more reflective. His office was lined with books, not just legal texts, but history, philosophy. He had kind eyes and a calm demeanor that invited confidence. I explained my situation simply. I was finalizing a divorce and needed to revise my will accordingly. He nodded, understanding, asking gentle questions about my assets, my children, my wishes. There was no judgment, only professional guidance. When it came to the primary beneficiary, I didn't hesitate. "I want everything to go directly to my children, Mark and Claire, in equal shares," I stated, my voice clear and steady. Mr. Davies made a note. "And previously?" he inquired mildly. "My soon-to-be ex-husband was the primary beneficiary." He looked up, a flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps just professional neutrality, in his eyes. "And you wish to remove him entirely?" Entirely, I confirmed. We discussed contingencies, trusts for the children if needed, appointing an executor. I chose Claire, knowing she had the maturity and fairness Mark currently lacked, influenced as he was by his father. We talked about my parents' assets, ensuring the wording was precise, leaving no loopholes, no room for interpretation or challenge. It felt strangely empowering, sitting there in that quiet office, making these decisions for myself about my future, my legacy. It was a quiet act of rebellion, a reclaiming of control in the face of Richard's blatant disregard. He had made grand, public gestures of rejection. I was making quiet, private arrangements for my independence. There was a particular antique writing desk, a family heirloom from my mother's side, that Richard had always admired, hinting heavily that it would look perfect in his study. In the old will, I'd specifically bequeathed it to him. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, I instructed Mr. Davies to leave it to Claire, who appreciated its history and craftsmanship far more than Richard ever could. It was a small detail, symbolic perhaps only to me, but it felt significant. Signing the new will felt like closing a door, firmly and finally. Not with anger, but with a sense of profound rightness. This was my life, my legacy, built not just on the assets I possessed, but on the values my parents had instilled in me: resilience, integrity, quiet strength. Richard had forfeited any claim to it, not just legally, but morally. As I left Mr. Davies' office, clutching the discreetly bound copy of my new will, the city streets seemed brighter. The weight on my shoulders, the one I hadn't fully realized I was carrying, felt lighter. It wasn't about denying Richard something he was entitled to; he wasn't entitled to it. It was about affirming my own worth, my own future, independent of him. He had assumed my compliance, my predictability, my continued orbit around his needs even after casting me aside. He had underestimated me, just as he always had. He focused on the immediate gains, the flashy new life, the quick sale of assets. He never considered the long game, the quiet power of a woman reclaiming her narrative, one legal document at a time. The chill I'd felt for so long hadn't disappeared entirely, but the ember of defiance had grown into a steady, warming flame. Life began to settle into a new rhythm, quieter but increasingly my own. The final divorce decree arrived, a thick packet of legal jargon that formalized the end of an era. There was a pang, yes, a moment of sadness for the 32 years that now felt like a preamble to this solitary chapter. But overlying the sadness was a growing sense of peace, of possibility. Richard, true to form, moved on quickly and loudly. He and Tiffany bought a sleek, modern condo downtown, photos appearing on social media, gatherings with mutual friends who had seemingly chosen sides, exotic holidays, beaming selfies captioned with nauseating hashtags about soulmates and new beginnings. It stung initially, that public display of choreographed happiness. But the sting lessened with time, replaced by a strange detachment, as if watching characters in a play I was no longer part of. Then came the inevitable phone call. It was Richard, his voice oozing the familiar charm he switched on like a tap. He started with small talk, asking about the house, feigning interest in the garden I was slowly bringing back to life. Then, the pivot. "Listen, Alina," he said, lowering his voice confidentially, "about that inheritance from your folks. I know it's still some way off, hopefully a long way off, but I was thinking, that property, it's in a prime location now. If we handled the sale smartly, maybe did a few upgrades first, we could really maximize the return. Enough for a solid trust for Mark and Claire, and perhaps ease things for both of us, you know?" I held the phone, listening to his assumptions, his casual appropriation of my family legacy, my future financial security. We could maximize the return, ease things for both of us. He still saw it as a joint asset, something he had a right to influence, to benefit from. The old Alina might have stammered, deflected, felt obligated to consider his input. But the woman holding the phone now, the one who had sat in Mr. Davies' quiet office, was different. "Richard," I said, my voice calm, steady, devoid of the emotion he likely expected. "My parents' estate and my own affairs are my concern. They aren't something we need to discuss." There was a beat of silence on the other end. Surprise, confusion. "Well, yes, of course, technically," he sputtered, the charm faltering slightly. "But practically speaking, thinking of the children, Mark and Claire will be well taken care of according to my wishes." "Richard," I interrupted gently but firmly, "you don't need to worry about that. My financial planning is handled." I didn't mention the will. I didn't need to. The shift was in my tone, my refusal to engage on his terms, my quiet assertion of boundaries he had never encountered from me before. He tried another angle, suggesting lunch to catch up properly, likely hoping to deploy his persuasive powers in person. "I don't think that's necessary, Richard," I replied politely. "We can handle any outstanding practicalities through email." Another pause, this time laced with nascent irritation. "Fine, Alina, if that's how you want to be." The implication was clear. I was being difficult, unreasonable. The old script, but it didn't land anymore. It's how things are, Richard, I said, and before he could respond, I added a polite, I have to go now, goodbye. And I hung up, not angrily, not triumphantly, just decisively. I sat there for a moment, the silence of the house feeling different now, not empty but peaceful. He didn't know about the will, not specifically, but he knew something had changed. He felt the shift in power, the withdrawal of my assumed compliance. He'd reached for a lever he'd always controlled, only to find it disconnected. The quiet satisfaction was profound. The fallout wasn't explosive, but it rippled outwards. Mark called a few days after my conversation with Richard. His tone was strained, echoing his father's injured bewilderment. Dad mentioned you spoke, he began tentatively. He seemed a bit upset, said you were resistant about discussing future finances, even for me and Claire. My heart ached for my son, caught in his father's web of entitlement and manipulation. Mark, I said gently, your father and I are divorced. My finances, including any inheritance I might receive, are my own business now. He doesn't have a say in how I manage them or what plans I make. But he was just trying to help Mom, to make sure we're all okay. I appreciate your concern, sweetheart, truly, but I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs and ensuring you and Claire are provided for. Your father's ideas about maximizing returns often involve risks I'm not comfortable with, especially when it involves my parents' legacy. I could hear the frustration in his sigh. Richard had clearly framed my boundary setting as hostility towards him, and by extension, perhaps even towards Mark's future. It just seems like you're trying to cut him out completely, Mark mumbled. Your father cut me out, Mark, I replied, the words sharp despite my attempt at softness. He made his choices. Now I'm making mine. My will reflects my wishes, and it ensures both you and Claire are treated fairly and protected. That's all you need to know. He didn't push further, but the call ended with a coolness that saddened me. Richard's influence ran deep. Claire, however, seemed to understand implicitly. During one of our quiet afternoons, weeding the now thriving garden together, she said, Dad seems to think he still gets a vote on everything, doesn't he? I just smiled sadly. He's used to being the chairman of the board, honey. Well, she said, carefully untangling a stubborn vine from a rose bush, Mom's the CEO of her own life now. Her simple statement, her quiet support, meant more than she could know. Around that time, I made another decision. The house. It held too many ghosts, too many echoes of a life that no longer existed. Richard had wanted me to sell it quickly for his benefit. Now I decided to sell it for mine. I listed it with an agent Sarah recommended, took my time preparing it, and accepted an offer that felt right, not rushed. Packing up 32 years was emotionally draining, sorting through possessions, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to discard. Each object held a memory, some painful, some bittersweet. I found the chipped mug I'd held that first day after he left and paused. Instead of packing it, I carried it outside and placed it gently amongst the newly blooming roses in the garden bed. A small offering to the past, perhaps. Finding a new place, a smaller apartment with a sunny balcony perfect for pots of herbs and flowers, felt like a fresh start. It was mine, chosen by me, decorated to my taste, filled only with the things I truly loved. Richard heard about the house sale through Mark, of course. He called, predictably, asking about the sale price, undoubtedly calculating his perceived share of the profit, even though the division of assets was long settled. I politely referred him to the final divorce decree and ended the conversation. He couldn't touch this, it was mine. The move was exhausting but liberating. As the movers carried the last box out of the old house, I took one final look around the empty rooms. No anger, no tears, just a quiet sense of closure. I had walked into that house as a young woman full of dreams for a shared future. I was walking out as a woman reclaiming her own. The years since the divorce haven't been a seamless journey into blissful independence, of course. There are still moments of melancholy, echoes of the life I thought I'd have. Holidays can be challenging, navigating the fractured family dynamic, seeing Mark still trying to balance loyalty to both parents, often defaulting to his father's narrative. But the overwhelming feeling is one of peace, hard-won and deeply cherished. My apartment feels like a sanctuary, filled with light, books, music, and the scent of the herbs growing on my balcony. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had stood by me quietly, and made new ones through a book club and volunteering at the local library, finally surrounded by the quiet corners and dusty shelves I dreamed of as a girl. I even started writing again, not the ambitious novel I once planned, but short pieces, observations, reflections on resilience and change. Claire is my rock, our bond deepened by the storms we weathered. We have regular dinners, share laughter and frustrations, and tend the balcony garden together. She respects my choices, including the ones regarding my will, understanding the need for boundaries her father never could. Mark is slowly, tentatively, finding his own perspective. He sees his father's relationship with Tiffany with clearer eyes now, noticing the superficiality beneath the shine, the same self-absorption that characterized his marriage to me. He calls more often, asking about me, not just relaying messages from his father. Healing takes time. Richard, I hear about him occasionally. His grand business venture apparently didn't take off as planned. His assumptions about leveraging my inheritance obviously proved unfounded. He and Tiffany are still together, maintaining their glossy facade, though friends whisper about tensions beneath the surface. We coexist civilly at family events involving the children, exchanging polite, distant greetings. He still carries that air of entitlement, but it no longer has the power to wound me. He looks older, the charm wearing thin around the edges, revealing the bitterness underneath. He knows, I suspect, about the will. Not because I told him, but because the expected financial inquiries, the subtle attempts to gauge my resources, ceased after a while. Perhaps Mark or Claire let something slip, or perhaps he simply inferred it from my unshakable financial independence. He doesn't ask anymore. The power dynamic shifted definitively that day I refused to discuss my inheritance. He had replaced me with his secretary, assuming I was disposable, interchangeable. In response, I hadn't sought vengeance, but self-preservation. I had quietly, firmly replaced him in the future he took for granted, securing my own legacy, protecting what was rightfully mine. It wasn't about the money itself. It was about the principle, the quiet assertion that my life, my resources, my future were not his to control or claim. The chipped mug sits on my new kitchen windowsill, catching the morning sun. It's a reminder not of the day he left, but of the day I started to find my way back to myself. The chill is gone, replaced by a quiet warmth, a strength I didn't know I possessed until I was forced to excavate it from the ruins of betrayal. He thought he was writing the end of my story. He underestimated the author.